It's time for another gaming PC build, and this time, well, I've gone with AM5 again because let's be honest, it's probably the best gaming platform out there. But if you wanted to follow this gaming PC build, I will link to all of the parts in the description below with some other alternatives / recommendations that I've got depending on what your use case is. But I want to say a big thank you to MSI for sending out their B650 Tomahawk Wi-Fi for this video, so massive shout out to them. But without any more talking, let's get this gaming machine built. So for the CPU, I think I'm going to go with the Ryzen 5 8600G, purely because it's the only AM5 CPU that I've got spare. So yeah, for the most part, it's a decent CPU with some pretty good integrated graphics, but yeah, it's going to pair well with our GPU today, put it that way. Speaking of which, I'm not going to go with the 6700 XT, I did that last time. The RK750 is in my editing PC, so RX 6600, I think that should pair well with our GPU today, so yeah, we should be getting some decent 1080p gaming performance, and it's got PCIe 4.0 8X, like this CPU as well, so there's going to be no bandwidth limitations there. So yeah, it'll pair well with the 8600G. And of course, 32GB of DDR5 memory. What more could you ask for? And it's time to peel off the motherboard. There we go, that looks quite good, doesn't it? I like the look of the Tomahawk boards. They do look understated in a very sleek looking way, so yeah, it's a brilliant looking board. As I don't like stock coolers, I think I'm going to use the NHU12S from Noctua. It's an absolutely brilliant cooler, and this will have absolutely zero issues cooling a Ryzen 5. And of course, it's the Chromax Black version as well, so it looks very, very nice. Yeah, I'd take an aftermarket air cooler any day of the week over the stock bundled ones because they just look a lot better, and of course, they perform a lot better as well, particularly with Noctua. The silent, the cool grey, what more could you ask for? But if you were on a budget, of course, the stock Wraith Stealth cooler is going to be totally fine with an 8600G, and by extension, the Ryzen 5 7600 and those types of CPUs. So if you were on a super tight budget, you don't need to buy a cooler like this, but it's a nice to have. And now in goes the RAM, if it wants to click down properly. There we go. And of course, the second stick. Now it's time to install the motherboard, which is kind of always hard when your case isn't flat, but thankfully NZXT engineered a sort of a nut for the middle where it's sort of like just holds the motherboard in place. Before I put the power supply in, I always like to manage the sort of the front panel headers and the front panel audio and those sorts of auxiliary connectors, I suppose, because they're a bit easier to cable manage behind the power supply. Speaking of which, the USB 3.0 on this motherboard is a right angled one, so props to MSI for that, because that connector, autofocus, what are you doing? Autofocus, hello? There we go. Because the USB 3.0 connector is one of the worst ones ever conceived by humanity. But thankfully, MSI has done a right-angled one here, so big props to them. Speaking of power supplies, I've been meaning to showcase this one, and it's the straight Power 12 from Be Quiet. Originally, they sent this out for a different project, but I didn't use it in that one, as I had the 1000 watt model, but I'm going to use it today. Truth be known, for this PC build, 850 watts is massively overkill. You'd be fine with like 550, but overkill is a good thing, I guess, and it's a really good power supply. This is the best thing about modular power supplies. You only use the cables that you actually need to use, so you don't need to cable manage unnecessary cables in your PC build, which obviously makes it a bit easier for you, but it also makes it look a lot cleaner as well. And last but not least, the motherboard cable, which is always a bit of a pain to install, but as soon as you get it installed, it's really not that much of a problem. Installing your power supply is one of the easier tasks you can do with PCs, and all you've got to do is just manage a bunch of cables, really, in all honesty. But other than that, it's really not that hard. And as you can see with the NZXT H700, which is the case I'm building with, you've got to put the power supply in through the back, which does require a bit of, let's say, cable movement, but to be fair, as you can see, it's really not that hard. Keeping with the MSI theme is the graphics card, and I've decided to go with, there we go, if it wants to go into the slot, the MSI RX 6600 Mech OC. It's a pretty decent graphics card. I deemed it to be one of the best value GPUs in 2024, and to be honest, if you want to play at 1080p and even 1440p in some titles, this GPU is totally fine for it. And left over from my previous build is this cable extension, and I think it's going to look pretty decent in here if I can actually get the, there we go. So I think this is going to look pretty good in here. If we just cable manage it correctly, we should be all ready to go. Yeah, and it keeps coming up, but we'll cable manage it just well, don't worry. Now it's time for everyone's favourite part of a PC build, the cable management. And if I'm honest, I've never liked it, and I probably never will, but it needs to be done regardless. Thankfully, the H700, which I've had for about 5 years now, and probably its successor, the H7 Flow, I believe it's called, has pretty decent cable management with a lot of channels, so at least it makes the job easy for you. But if your cable management is done somewhat okay, you should be able just to get the side panel on with not a lot of stress at all, to be honest. As you can probably see, I haven't done it too well. Yeah. So there's the final build. Let's see. There we go. The button's a bit dodgy on this case, but let's see if it all works fine. So then, the PC's built, and honestly, it's probably not the best looking PC I've ever built in my life because it is my old workstation case, so it is pretty beat up, but it's the only spare ATX case I had on hand. However though, all things considered, I think it turned out looking pretty well. It's got minimal use of RGB, which is what I was going for, as the only RGB product in this PC is the RAM. And of course, I've set that to yellow to match with the GPU cable extension, as I had that left over from my main PC. So, is it an understated PC? Yes. Do I think it looks good? Yeah, kind of. But it's all good if a PC looks pretty on your desk. What is the gaming performance like? To find out, I've ran some benchmarks, so let's see how it gets on. Cyberpunk is a game which probably isn't as hard to run as I originally imagined, because 68 FPS on average with a 1% low of 10 frames per second below that proves to me on the high preset that Cyberpunk 2077 really isn't that hard to run on anything that's considered mid-range ever since sort of like 2020. So if you've got a similar PC build to this, Cyberpunk 2077 is totally fine, as long as you stick to rasterization performance at 1080p and maybe even 1440p as well. Fortnite is up next, and unlike usual, I tested using the DirectX 11 API, as I believe you can get a few more frames using this. However, on the low preset with TAA anti-aliasing, 300 plus FPS on average is a nice to have. So if you had a 360Hz FreeSync monitor, performance is going to be absolutely brilliant. The 1% low as well is 180-ish, which is not particularly brilliant, but by Fortnite standards, that's not too bad. Jedi Survivor, as always, is a bit of a hard game to run. To be honest, it's not really optimized that well, but even so, on the high preset, getting just south of 60 frames per second on average, and the 1% low is a bit lower than that, let's be honest. It's still playable in my opinion, but I would highly recommend tweaking a few settings. Maybe going down to the medium preset and keeping the textures on high, something like that will be perfectly fine, and you should be getting at least 60 frames per second on average. Rainbow Six Siege, what can you say? This game is ridiculously easy to run on the low preset, and that goes to show today. Getting above 400 frames per second on average is great performance in my book, and then again, the 1% low at just below 300 frames per second means the frame delivery is nice and smooth, and you'll be having absolutely zero problems, maybe apart from your skill, in Rainbow Six Siege. Hogwarts Legacy is just proving it's an excellently optimised game. Not so much with the 1% lows, but the average frame rates, they're looking pretty good. Over 80 FPS on average, with the 1% low is still above 60 FPS, to give it credit. But on the high preset, this is brilliant performance. And I believe if you were to raise this to the Epic preset, I believe it's called on this game, you'd still be getting above 60 frames per second on average at full HD. Just like Hogwarts Legacy, Spider-Man Remastered is absolutely excellently optimised. 85 FPS on average with a 1% low of 59 frames per second. The 1% low does tend to drop while web slinging, so that's to be expected. This performance on the very high preset is absolutely brilliant, and to be honest, I wouldn't change any of the settings around. Leave it on this preset with this hardware. So for 1080p gaming with relatively high settings enabled, this gaming PC is totally fine for it. The only game that didn't really perform that well today was Jedi Survivor, but we all know what sort of a PC port that's like because, yeah, it's kind of a spaghetti code mush. But even then, you could enable the medium preset or just tweak a few settings around and you should be golden in that game. For the rest of the AAA games like Cyberpunk 2077, Hogwarts Legacy, you're set for more than 60 FPS on average with the high preset. And even in the case of Hogwarts Legacy, I suspect if you were to enable the very high preset, or Epic I believe it's called on that game, you should be golden. And then of course, there was no doubt about it, esports games on a gaming PC like this is going to be no bother at all. Even the 8600G is capable of just delivering stupidly high frame rates paired with the RX 6600. Like in the case of Rainbow Six Siege, I believe it was like 400 plus frames per second, which is, yeah, I'm not sure if you're going to need any more than that, put it that way. But this is probably where you'd see some improvement going with a better CPU like the Ryzen 5 7600. The CPU front of that processor is a lot better. It's got more cache, double that of the 8600G, and I believe it does clock slightly higher as well, so that will help out in CPU-bound esports games. But then again, I really think you're not going to be seeing that much of a difference between these two CPUs in these sorts of titles, particularly with an RX 6600. Keeping with the CPU, you'd probably see similar frame rates, particularly in AAA games, if you were to go with a lower end processor. Truth be known, the 8600G is a bit overkill for the RX 6600. It will pair well with GPUs like the RX 6700 XT, which is something I did in the past. And even then, I would still probably recommend the Ryzen 5 7600 if you're going with a dedicated GPU from the get-go, because after all, it's a better processor and it's cheaper. It just doesn't have the Radeon 760M graphics. But the motherboard it's slotted into is something I wouldn't change, because the B650 Tomahawk Wi-Fi is an absolutely brilliant motherboard. The VRMs on there are pretty overkill, and you'd be fine with something like a 7800X3D. So if you wanted a relatively affordable motherboard, it only costs about £160 here in the UK, and a Ryzen 5 7800X3D, I mean, it'll be totally fine. And this is something I want to do in the future, so I might just be sourcing one of those X3D Zen 4 chips. Is it Zen 4 or is it Zen 5? It's Zen 4. So a massive thank you to both MSI and eBuyer for sending out this motherboard. It will be linked in the description below, and I think if you're going for like sort of an understated PC build, or if you're just looking for an excellent value AM5 motherboard, I mean, the B650 Tomahawk will be an excellent option, if you ask me. But if you're not into gaming and you're more of a productivity user, I'd probably recommend Intel for a lot of workflows. But if you want to go to AM5 because it benefits your workflow, for instance, this motherboard should take a 7950X as well. So yeah, no issues there. So if you want to see another gaming PC build, there'll be one up there, and there will also be a review for the RX 6600 down there. And I'll catch you in the next one.